You're listening to the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast. Remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell to make sure you get the latest episodes of the podcast. Be sure to like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast. And on today's episode of the podcast, we're reviewing the group stage of the ICC T20 World Cup for 2024 and previewing the Super 8 stage of the ICC T20 World Cup for 2024. And we've seen some great cricket throughout the group stage of this T20 World Cup. Games that have gone down to the wire. Outstanding performances with both bat and ball and from all the teams as well. And also the associate countries have performed well and have shown us what they're all about in this tournament as well. So we've seen some very good cricket across the board. Also, the Super 8 stage is sure to be one of the most exciting parts of this T20 World Cup this year. And no doubt those 8 teams fighting for 4 spots in the semi-finals will definitely provide us with some entertaining cricket. And let's hope we get some top-level T20 cricket from that part of the tournament. So there's plenty to talk about, plenty to discuss as we unpacked the group stage of this tournament, plus previewing the Super 8s and what to expect there. So there's plenty to talk about. Without further ado, let's get into it. Let's have a look at all the groups in this ICC T20 World Cup for 2024 and review all the groups and the team's performances in each group and talk about that. We'll start off with Group A. Group A contained the USA, the co-hosts, India, Pakistan, Canada, and Ireland. India finished on top in Group A. They won 3 games from 4. USA finished in second. Pakistan in third. Fourth was Canada, and fifth was Ireland. They did not win a game at all. And that's how Group A finished after the group stage. Going into this tournament, Group A was going to be pretty straightforward, as many people said. Many people predicted India and Pakistan were going to go through easily to qualify for the Super 8s, but that wasn't the case. India and the USA, in the end, going through from Group A to the Super 8s. The USA, probably the biggest surprise from Group A. Obviously, India, as expected, finished on top of the group. Clearly the strongest team in Group A. Did well to win those games in New York City on that pitch, that difficult pitch at the Nassau County Stadium. They won 3 games pretty much from playing at that venue. Obviously, the last game against Canada was washed out for them in Florida, but nonetheless, that was enough for India to go through to the group stage. So by far, India was the strongest team. And also the USA was the biggest surprise, winning 2 games. The first game against Canada did well in the run chase. Aaron Jones was outstanding. And then beating Pakistan to win in a super over, their biggest win in their history. And they deserved a place in the Super 8s, the USA. And I think everyone who organized this T20 World Cup to be in the West Indies and the USA, I think the ICC deep down would have hoped that the USA would have a good tournament. And they have. Whatever happens in the Super 8s happen for the USA. Whatever happens there will happen. But to qualify and to get through is a big achievement in itself. You know, the game against Pakistan, they were outstanding. To be fair, Pakistan have been very poor. But for USA as a whole, trying to grow and develop the sport in the States, I think everyone would be very pleased that the USA were able to get through. And definitely the biggest surprise in Group A, that's for sure. I think everyone was very surprised when they won against Pakistan. They had that good win against Canada, which really set the tone for the tournament as well. So, as I said, they thoroughly deserve their place in the Super 8s. And already it's a success for the USA in this tournament. They've already achieved a lot of great things in the tournament. Pakistan were very disappointing. With both bat and ball, they were absolutely dreadful. Pakistan, the batting was poor. The bowling was poor. The game against India was poor. They should have won that game, but they didn't. The game against the USA, they were on top and then, came down to a super over and they lost it by making mistakes and errors. And just Pakistan weren't really on it. They weren't really playing as a team. They weren't really connecting as well with each other. It was just a terrible performance by them, and very disappointed that they weren't able to make it out of the group stage. So Pakistan, disappointing, struggled with both bat and ball, as I said, and they'll be very disappointed with their performance in this tournament. And then Ireland and Canada. They had mixed results, Ireland and Canada, in this tournament. Ireland didn't win a single game. One of the games was washed out. They lost 3 games. They really underperformed Ireland. Canada, for Canada, to be fair, it's their first ever T20 World Cup. So a lot of these players were experiencing the T20 World Cup for the first time. They should have won the first game against the USA, but they didn't, and then struggled after that. They were able to beat Ireland. That was their only win of the tournament. Then they lost against Pakistan and USA, and they had the no result against India. So for Canada, a bit of an experience for them. They'll definitely learn a lot from this tournament. But definitely Ireland and Canada will be disappointed about their results in Group A. So that's pretty much the overview on Group A and how Group A panned out in the group stage. We now move on and talk about Group B. And let's have a look at Group B. Now, Group B contained Australia, England, Scotland, Namibia, and Oman. Australia finished on top. They were undefeated. They won 4 from 4. England qualified just. Obviously, Australia doing them a favour, beating Scotland. So England finished in second to get that second spot to qualify for the Super 8s. And then Scotland finished in third place, and then Namibia in fourth, and then Oman in fifth, who did not win a single game at all. As expected, going into this T20 World Cup, that Australia and England would qualify from Group B. And that turned out to be the case, but it wasn't as straightforward as everyone predicted. Obviously, what happened with England, the washout game against Scotland, then losing to Australia in the way they did, and then Scotland winning 2 games, plus the net run rate being superior to England. England were really under the pump to qualify and had to beat Namibia and Oman by big margins, which they did in the end. And they had to rely on Australia beating Scotland. And during the Australia and Scotland match, it looked like at one stage Australia were going to lose, but then they came back and won the game. And then obviously England qualified because of that result. Obviously, Australia clearly the strongest team in the group, being undefeated. They're one of the favourites to win the tournament after all. And they won 4 from 4. Very strong team, and obviously one of the favourites to win the tournament. So not a surprise that Australia finished on top. England, as mentioned before, had their qualifying challenges to qualify for the Super 8s, as we've just stated. But even though they've qualified for the Super 8s, they still need to address certain things with their batting and bowling. Obviously, they had a couple of great wins against Namibia and Oman, but they really don't count for anything, really, because of the quality of opposition. Really, the big test for them in this group was Australia in that game. And also the game against Scotland, they weren't looking like winning that game at one stage because of the way Scotland started with the bat. So England have got some problems still going forward into the Super 8s, as we'll talk about a bit later on in this episode. Then you had Scotland. They were a bit unlucky not to qualify, Scotland. I thought Scotland really played well in this tournament. They had 2 great wins over Namibia and Oman. The game against England, which was washed out, but they played really well in that game. Unlucky not to win that game against England, because if they won that game against England, pretty much Scotland would have been going through anyway. And then in the last game of the group against Australia, they played really well, Scotland. They took it up to Australia, but in the end, Australia were too strong and they were able to get the job done. So I think for Scotland, I think they'll be very happy about how they performed in this T20 World Cup. I think it's one of their best T20 World Cup results for a very long time. So I think for Scotland, they'll be disappointed not to qualify, but there's a lot of good signs from Scotland, good improvement. They played really well and clearly should have gone through to the Super 8s. And then you had Namibia and Oman. Both teams were very disappointed, were very disappointing, especially Oman didn't win a game. But obviously for Oman, the quality of Australia and England and obviously Scotland and Namibia, for Oman, it was all about just trying to learn and get better from each game. They played some good cricket at times. but then other times they were let down by some errors and some poor choices. Namibia, the same as well. Had a good win over Oman in that super over early on in the tournament. They got absolutely flogged against Australia in that game where they were bowled out for 70-odd. And then they struggled against England as well. So I think Namibia and Oman will be disappointed about their results and how they performed in this group. But it was a very tough group, with Australia, England, and Scotland playing so well. It was always going to be tough for Namibia and Oman. So that's a bit of a snapshot of what happened in Group B. We move on and talk about Group C of this T20 World Cup. And Group C contained the West Indies, New Zealand, Afghanistan, Papua New Guinea, and Uganda. The West Indies finished on top. They were undefeated in the group. They won 4 from 4, followed by Afghanistan, who qualified in second place. And then you had New Zealand in third place, Uganda in fourth place, and then in last place, not winning a single game at all, was Papua New Guinea. Now, going into this tournament, Group C was heavily talked about going into this tournament because of the three-way battle between the West Indies, Afghanistan, and New Zealand. That was quickly put to bed when Afghanistan rolled New Zealand for 75, and the West Indies defeated New Zealand as well. Pretty much it was the West Indies and Afghanistan going through once New Zealand lost those 2 games. So that pretty much put that to bed in terms of that three-way battle. The West Indies, Afghanistan, 2 of the strongest teams in Group C. The West Indies looking good and could go all the way. Afghanistan have played some good cricket. Obviously, the game against New Zealand, as I mentioned, when they were bowled out for 75, that was a good performance by Afghanistan. So Afghanistan could be a surprise team to reach the semi-finals potentially, as we'll talk about a bit later when we do preview the Super 8's. But clearly, there were the 2 strongest teams. And then you moved on to New Zealand. New Zealand were absolutely poor. Terrible from New Zealand. Terrible. They weren't themselves. They batted poorly. They fielded poorly. They bowled poorly. They were underprepared. And no one really looked like getting in form or making any sort of difference whatsoever. They had 2 wins against Uganda and Papua New Guinea, pretty much as constellation wins. But really, when they lost to Afghanistan in that first game by 70, when they were bowled out for 75, that pretty much set the tone for them in this tournament. And then when they played against the West Indies, the same thing happened again. And that was pretty much the end of their Super 8 hopes. Very underwhelming from New Zealand. Won't be surprised if New Zealand make a lot of changes to their T20 side going forward after this result, because it's probably one of their worst T20 World Cup and World Cup results combined in ages, because with New Zealand, they've done pretty well in world events over the last few years. They've made it to semi-finals and then finals, but unfortunately not to be in this T20 World Cup. Papua New Guinea, Uganda struggled, obviously being the 2 associate nations in the group, but we saw Uganda winning that memorable game against Papua New Guinea only by 3 wickets in that game. And a great story, Uganda. A wonderful story to be here even, in fact. And Papua New Guinea, they'll be disappointed not to win a game. They should have backed themselves to win the game against Uganda, but they weren't able to get the job done there. And Uganda played well on the day and deserved that memorable win. But Papua New Guinea, they've been very strong for some time in the associate world when it comes to the Pacific region. But yeah, they'll be disappointed not to win a game in this T20 World Cup. But they'll definitely learn a lot from the experience. So will Uganda. And that's what it's all about with the 20-team World Cup. Obviously, these associate nations get an opportunity and a chance to showcase their skills and to get that exposure. So definitely a learning process for both Uganda and Papua New Guinea. So that's pretty much what happened in Group C, a bit of a snapshot there. And last but not least, Group D. Now, Group D contained South Africa, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Netherlands, and Nepal. Now, Group D, just like Group C, was going to be a 3-way battle. South Africa would finish on top because they were one of the strongest teams in this group, and that turned out to be the case. And then Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and the Netherlands would battle it out for that second spot. So in the end, South Africa did finish on top, but it was Bangladesh who was the biggest surprise in Group D. No one really predicted them to qualify for the Super 8s, but they were able to do it. South Africa, clearly the strongest team in Group D, but their results were very tight. They lost. They only won by 4 runs against Bangladesh on that very difficult surface in New York, and we all know what happened there with the leg byes and the controversy there. And also nearly lost to Nepal by 1 run. They just got over the line by 1 run, nearly lost to Nepal. So those 2 results were unconvincing, but they were able to get the job done in the end. But clearly the strongest team from the group when you looked at the rankings and where everyone was placed. And then you had Bangladesh. No one really expected them to reach the Super 8s after losing to the USA in that T20 warm-up series before the tournament started. They lost the series 2-1. The USA won 2 games against them. Many people thought they weren't going to do well in this T20 World Cup and they weren't going to qualify for the Super 8s. Well, they won 3 games and lost 1. That game against South Africa. They could have won, but obviously went down to the wire. But they surprised people and they were able to go through to the Super 8s. And then you had Sri Lanka and the Netherlands. Both of them were very poor, I thought. Sri Lanka were very poor, especially the games in New York that they played. They were very underwhelming. It was a difficult surface, to be fair, but really poor performances there from Sri Lanka. And also the Netherlands were very poor as well. They started well. They had the good win over Nepal, but then after that, they sort of fell away and they weren't really at their best, to be honest. So both of those teams will be disappointed about their performance in the group stage. And then last but not least, Nepal. Nepal, they played some good cricket at times in Nepal. The game against South Africa, they should have won. They lost by 1 run. And how close they came to causing the biggest upset in this tournament. Beating South Africa. Even though the game didn't matter, the game didn't have anything riding on it. Nepal were already knocked out. South Africa were already going to go through to the Super 8s. But for Nepal to win that game, it would have meant a lot. Their supporters, their fans have been very vocal, very enthusiastic in this tournament. It's great to see. And Nepal will be very disappointed to lose by 1 run against South Africa. But the main thing for Nepal is to have this exposure, play against the world's best teams in the world. And as an associate nation, I think they'll learn a lot from this tournament. And they should take a lot out of this tournament as well, especially in the performance against South Africa, where they didn't quite get the job done, but they nearly caused an upset. So that's pretty much how Group D played out, and that's how it finished, really. We now move on and let's preview the Super 8s of the T20 World Cup for 2024. Pretty much look at Groups 1 and 2 and predict who could make the semi-finals. Who will be the 4 teams that will make it to the semi-finals of this T20 World Cup for 2024. Now, you have 2 groups in the Super 8s, basically 4 teams in 2 groups. So Group 1, India, Australia, Afghanistan, Bangladesh. And then Group 2, you have the West Indies, USA, England, and South Africa. So let's go through each group and talk about all the teams and what they need to do to qualify for the semi-finals and predict who may make it to the semi-finals. We'll start with Group 1. Group 1, India, Australia, Afghanistan, Bangladesh. A very strong group. You have India, Australia, Afghanistan. I see them as the likely teams to contend for a semi-final spot, to battle it out for a semi-final spot. I see Bangladesh probably struggling in that group because India and Australia and Afghanistan have played some very good cricket in this T20 World Cup thus far. And Bangladesh, people didn't really expect them to be here. So for Bangladesh, they've got no expectations on them to progress to a semi-final. So, for them, they can play with some freedom and they can just, see what they can do. They may cause some problems for India, Australia, and Afghanistan, may put a spanner in the works, make it difficult for those teams to try and qualify for the semi-finals. So in terms of potential semi-finalists, who I see from Group 1 progressing to the semi-finals, I see Australia and India going through. I think they're the 2 strongest teams, but you can't discount Afghanistan. Afghanistan have really improved over the last few World Cups, T20s and 50-over World Cups. We saw that last year, didn't we, in the 50-over World Cup. They're going to be a challenge, and both India and Australia will know that Afghanistan should not be taken lightly. they may be the surprise team. And I mentioned earlier in this episode, I did mention that Afghanistan could do a Kenya. Someone that you don't expect to go through to a semi-final. Kenya did that in 2003. Afghanistan may do that in 2024. And I suppose this T20 World Cup for Afghanistan, it was 14 years ago when they first played in any sort of T20 World Cup or 50-over World Cup. And I think everyone would remember they did play in 2010 in the T20 World Cup, which was in the Caribbean, where they burst onto the scene for the first time. And, for them to come back to the Caribbean 14 years later after playing their first ever, T20 World Cup in 2010, I think for them, if they do make the semi-finals and potentially a final, I think it will be a great achievement from Afghanistan in terms of, really developing as a cricketing nation. But I see India and Australia going through from Group 1. That's my semi-finalists from Group 1. Afghanistan could pose a challenge, but India and Australia, two strongest teams. They're both favourites to win this tournament. Afghanistan, they do rely heavily on their opening batters. And then once you get the opening batters out, then the rest of the batting does falter a little bit. Their bowling is pretty good in terms of the pace and spin. Their spin attack is going to be very, very effective on these surfaces that are going to turn and grip, as we've now entered the latter stage of the tournament where the wickets are a bit worn and definitely going to be conducive to spin. So they definitely are going to be dangerous in that sort of area with their spin. But I really see India and Australia progressing through to the semi-finals. So that's pretty much my semi-finalists from Group 1, Australia and India. But, I won't be surprised if Afghanistan makes it through. I don't think anyone would be because they have played some good cricket. We move on and talk about Group 2. Group 2, West Indies and USA, the co-hosts and the hosts. England and South Africa in Group 2 of the Super 8s. It's probably the easier of the two groups when you look at it. Definitely Group 1's definitely hard because you've got India and Australia and Afghanistan. But Group 2 is probably the easier of the two groups, but it's still going to be difficult nonetheless for those teams in Group 2 to go through to a semi-final because anything could happen in this point of the tournament. It's great to see the USA in Group 2. To see them qualify for a Super 8 spot. I think for the USA, whatever happens in Group 2 for them in this Super 8 stage, I think they should be very proud to make it to this point in the tournament. I don't see them going through to the semi-finals, obviously, because you got the West Indies and South Africa who could be the favourites. England, a bit hit or miss, but you can't rule them out, I suppose. So I do see the USA probably not making it through to the semi-finals. But you never know. They could do a Kenya. What Kenya did in 2003, be a team from the associate world to make it to a, semi-final. The only associate nation to make it to a semi-final of any World Cup is Kenya. And that was in 2003. So the USA could be the second team to join that list. And you never know. You can't discount it. But based on how the West Indies have played and South Africa have played, you see them as the two likely favourites from Group 2. And that's pretty much my favourites for Group 2. I've gone with the West Indies and South Africa, purely based because they're the two strongest teams. Could have an opportunity to go through to a semi-final. With England, now let's talk about England. To me, England have some problems. Obviously, with their batting and bowling, it's well documented in this tournament. But for England to go through to a semi-final in this T20 World Cup, they've got to defeat the West Indies and South Africa. They can definitely get the job done against the US, but they can't take them for granted. We saw what the US did to Pakistan. And England will know that. But for England to give them a chance of going through to the semi-finals, they've got to beat the West Indies and South Africa. I don't see that happening, for the reasons I just mentioned before. So for England, it's going to be a challenge for them to qualify for the semi-finals in this group. But as I said, anything can happen in the Super 8s. You don't know what's going to happen because you only play 3 games. There's 4 teams. You play 3 games. You lose 2 games. You lose 1 game. that could be make or break in terms of qualifying for a semi-final, because you can't lose more than 2. You've got to win at least 2 games, and then if you drop one, hope the net run rate's good, because it may come down to net run rate as well. All these possibilities and all these scenarios. But just to reiterate, from Group 2, I see the West Indies and South Africa progressing to the semi-finals, alongside India and Australia from Group 1. So those are my semi-final predictions in terms of the teams making it to the semi-finals. And it's going to be a very exciting, interesting Super 8 stage of the tournament. Let's hope we see some good cricket. Some final thoughts and concluding thoughts from our episode today on the group stage review and the preview of the Super 8 stage of this T20 World Cup for 2024. By having 20 teams in this T20 World Cup, plus 4 groups of 5 teams, has made it more interesting. And each game has had something of importance to it. We've seen that in this tournament, where teams have won games and qualified for the Super 8s, and other teams have lost games early and were put under severe pressure from the get-go. Obviously, like England had to qualify in Group B, obviously, and other teams in that sort of situation had to fight out for qualification. So every game has importance. Also, it showcased the associate nations to the world stage and had them to show everyone what they're made of, and gave them the opportunity to mix it with the big teams in the world. So definitely this format and what we saw on the group stage has definitely backed that up, that we did see some entertaining cricket and some wonderful cricket in this group stage of this T20 World Cup. And no doubt the format of 20 teams plus the group stage and the Super 8s has definitely backed that up indeed. So let's hope the Super 8 stage will provide some good cricket as well. There's some very good teams in that Super 8 stage of the tournament, and let's hope they provide some good cricket, just like we saw in the group stage of this T20 World Cup for 2024. Thanks everyone for listening to our review and preview of the group stage and the Super 8 stage of the ICC T20 World Cup for 2024. If you're watching or listening to this episode of the podcast on our YouTube channel, let us know your thoughts on the group stage and the Super 8s stage of this ICC T20 World Cup for 2024 in the comments. We would love to hear what you have to say. Thanks for watching and listening. Until next time, keep safe and bye for now.